Hi, my name is Lee Crow, and this is a video series on networking for people who could care less but need to know a little bit. This is the first video in this series of an unknown number of videos, and it's basically I'm making these for my brother, who is an aerospace engineer for NASA, and he's been tasked to take care of a couple of networks in his workplace, and networking has been my thing for a little over a decade now. So I'm unsure of how many videos there will be in this series right now. Basically, I'm just thinking off the cuff as he asks questions. It's so much easier to explain these things in a video or talking where he can see my screen versus trying to explain things in an email or a chat. So that's where this series originated from. So we'll start off with just basic subnetting. We're not going to get into too much detail about subnetting. That's going to be beyond the scope of this. As I said, it's in relation to what my brother is asking me. So you can see I have open the webpage www.subnet-calculator.com, and here on the top left portion of the screen we have the subnet calculator. For network class A, B, or C, again, this part is beyond the scope of this, but just know for now we're going to keep it selected to class C networks, and we're going to be dealing with addresses in the 192.168 space. We're going to also keep a subnet mask of 255.255.255.0, which is also represented by a 24-bit mask. And I'm doing this in order just to keep things really simple for now. If anybody has any additional questions, please try Google first, or ask questions in the YouTube comments, and I will try my best to answer them. So, okay. My brother basically has a situation where they have a non-production network that does not connect to the outside world, doesn't connect to the internet, and the range of IP addresses for his existing network is 192.168.1.1 all the way to .254. So you can see all I did to change that to represent and find out what my host address range is I just came up here to the IP address box and typed in any IP address really that's in that subnet, and I kept it with a 255.255.255.0 mask as promised. One thing to notice, and so you have a subnet ID and you have a broadcast address. These two addresses are basically unusable in your subnet. Your usable address range is going to be in this box right here, and that's going to be the 1 to .254. So your subnet ID, that's basically your network ID, your broadcast address. Okay, how to explain broadcasting with the with keeping it simple. Okay, it's another unusable address as far as hosts are concerned. But basically, if a host on the network wants to send out information to all other hosts on the same subnet that it's on, then it will send to this broadcast address, and then all other hosts on that subnet will receive it. Now, when I say subnet, in this example here, we have the IP address 192.168.1.1 with this 24-bit mask, and we have this host address range. All hosts that have an IP address within this host address range are considered on the same subnet. So that's what we mean by that. This is his existing subnet right here. They want to add more devices to the network. And when they add these devices to the network, the vendor, it's my understanding that the vendor recommends placing these devices on their own subnet. Now again, they're going to use a 24-bit mask for this new subnet, and so we can come up here and let's say that the 192.168.2.0 network is not in use, then, and if that's the one we want to use, I can come up here and change that to 2.1, and then everything else falls into place. My host address range would be 2.1 all the way to 2.254. This subnet bitmap down here, all IP addresses are really what you see here, these numbers. These are just decimal representations of a binary number. Subnet or IP addresses are actually, this for example would be an IP address. IP addresses are actually a 32-bit binary number in IP version 4. They are represented by 4 octets, and each placeholder here would represent 1 bit, and each section in this, each octet, is basically 8 bits of the 32-bit IP address. This subnet bitmap part down here, this is kind of beyond the scope of this video series right now, but you know, Google's your friend. There is a plethora of information. So there's a plethora of information on the internet about IP addressing. Let me see. So basically he wanted to add this new subnet into his network. There are many reasons for adding devices on a new subnet versus adding them to an existing subnet. For example, maybe you're running out of IP addresses on your existing subnet, or perhaps you know, the devices that you're adding to your network, maybe their traffic needs to be isolated from other devices on the network, with a few exceptions, and we'll kind of get more into that when we talk about VLANs. So you know, the reasons for creating additional subnet vary. Let me see. Within this IP address range, the 192.168.something.something, these are considered private IP addresses. There are other private IP address ranges, and I'm not going to get into that, but the basically what that means is you're not really allowed to connect these IP addresses directly to the internet. If you do, the internet's not going to your internet's not going to work, or that device isn't going to work on the internet. You have to have what's called routable or registered IP addresses in order to access the internet. Another thing that's kind of beyond the scope of this video series, but I just want you to be aware that this is considered basically like an internal use only kind of IP address. So the other thing is, when you look at your host address range down here, every device on your subnet, on every subnet, has to have a unique IP address, with a few rare exceptions. So if I have if my computer here, for example, is 192.168.2.5, I cannot configure another device on the network with that same IP address without there being some issues. So just keep that in mind. Every device on a subnet needs to have a unique IP address. So right now, as we have this configured, if we were just to plug this into a network switch, for example, by default, if we didn't do any configuration to the switch, then devices on subnet 1 will not be able to talk to devices on subnet 2 by default. In order to do that, we will need to basically configure routing between the subnets, and that will involve creating VLANs and so on, and we'll talk about that in a future video. So just be aware, when you configure multiple subnets on your plain network, on your switch that's right out of the box, if you put one computer on the 192.168.1.0 network, you put another computer on the 192.168.2.0 network, and if you plug those two devices into the same switch, by default they will not be able to communicate with one another, and there are additional configuration options that you have to do inside the switch in order to make that happen. So in the next video, I'll go into more detail about how you configure a host on the network. Basically, like how you would configure the basic settings that you would need to configure a PC or a Mac or even a switch to be put on your network so that it can communicate with other devices. And so that's all for this video. Thanks for watching.